Welcome to Breaking Indecision. Sometimes, our decision to plan the next best move doesn't always go as planned. What do we do in a world of chaos and overload of information? Do we do the right thing and still end up in the wrong place? From around the world, the Trilateral Strategic Steering Group is broadcasting a deeper dive into those questions that bring the how to the foresight on strategic decision making. Welcome back. Do we have an exciting episode for you today? I am Master Sergeant Philip Berry from Headquarters Air Force, A4 Logistics and Maintenance Director, Tesseract. And I will be your host on today's episode of Breaking Indecision. Our esteemed discussion hosts.
I'm Crew Captain Chuck Norris. I am the UK Exchange Officer in the Chief of the Air Force's Strategic Studies Group. I'm a helicopter pilot by trade, but I spent a lot of time in the UK MOD, our joint headquarters, and a NATO headquarters for the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps.
I'm Colonel Christophe Pubeni. I'm the French Exchange Officer working here at the Pentagon for almost 2 years and a half. My background, I'm an air mobility pilot. Started my career in 1998, C-160, and after I switched to OT&E, flying the Atlas.
We'll be interviewing a man that has lived through some of the toughest decisions.
Hi, everybody. I'm Admiral James Stavridis. I was the 16th Supreme Allied Commander at NATO. I'm a retired four-star officer in the United States Navy, and I'm currently the Vice Chairman of the Carlyle Group, a large international private equity firm, and Chairman of the Board of the Rockefeller Foundation.
I'll tell the lead if that's okay. So hopefully you've seen the questions that we put forward. I think based on your recent book as well, I think I can understand a little bit of your reasoning behind your decision-making process and your experiences. But do you think you could expand on that? How has your decision-making changed through your long and illustrious career?
I think, as is true for all of us, I began as an impulsive, younger kind of officer. If you mention the book, To Risk It All, which I wrote on this subject, kind of the young Stephen Decatur, impulsive, full of action. As I matured and encountered some of life's heavy seas, as we would say in the Navy, I grew, I think, as most people do, more deliberate, more cognizant of the impact of risk in making decisions. That is not to say we should ever allow ourselves to be prisoners of fear. We have to be optimistic, perhaps cautiously optimistic that our plans will succeed. On that point, one marvelous leader from the United States is someone I esteemed greatly, and that would have been General Colin Powell. And I encourage everyone to take a look at Colin Powell's 13 rules. They're a very simple formulation, and 4 of those 13 rules deal with optimism. Hope is a force multiplier. It will look better in the morning. Courage is the sum of our optimism. All of these are precepts that I tried to inculcate as I went through my life. So, Chuck, I'd say you start off young and impulsive and convinced you're absolutely invincible. You learn as you go along you're not, but you cannot give in to the naysayers. You have to continue to be optimistic in a cautious, sensible way, and I think that's the journey of risk that I've undertaken.
That's really, really enlightening, sir, and I'm definitely going to look up Colin Powell's 13 rules. How have you seen your decision-making process change, if at all, from those young tactical decisions through to those really difficult strategic decisions?
I think you are absolutely correct. As a young Navy lieutenant flying a Joint Strike Fighter, you're all about the tactical. You are all about that specific mission that you've been given. you ought to have a very general sense of the larger operational picture. I worked very hard to make sure junior officers in my strike group command, in my fleet commands, in my time as Supreme Allied Commander, junior officers ought to have a general operational sense of how their mission fits into the larger picture, because sometimes that can inform their tactical thinking. But you begin clearly as a tactician. I think then in the middle grades of a career, you tend to be focused on that operational level of art. How are the military activities undertaken on a much bigger canvas? Now you're not focused on a single flight or a single destroyer doing a freedom of navigation patrol, but rather, how do these pieces fit together operationally? For example, in the South China Sea, how do you fit together the satellite information, the intelligence, the location of critical assets, the bases, the logistics? How does all that fit together operationally? I think that's kind of the middle phase of career. And then as you get very senior, either yourself or you're on the staff of very senior officers, that's when you verge into the strategic. And this, I think NATO is a pretty good example. Here you have 30 nations, soon to be 32 nations. And when I was Supreme Allied Commander, 28 nations. And you have to understand strategically how each of the countries have different interests and different modalities, different capabilities. And here the example, I think, would be Afghanistan, where, tiny Iceland and Luxembourg are not going to make big strategic decisions, but the UK, France, US, the bigger nations are going to have a more of a strategic play. So as the military officer who is charged with conducting that kind of complex coalition, you have to take into account all the different culture, history, linguistic differences between the various nations as you formulate strategy. So in simplest terms, it really does proceed from single point tactical level missions to broader geographic operations, to finally trying to meld together strategy at a very, very global level.
So do you think your decision-making process has changed, or have you stuck to the same general premise all the way through?
My decision-making has changed in that I began, as I said previously, as a very impulsive actor who wanted to immediately get to a course of action. And as I got into my middle years, I was able to slow things down. And I talk in the book, To Risk It All, about decision makers needing to be conscious of how they can actually slow time down. And then finally, as I became more senior, you realize that you have got to carve out time to step back and bring together all the broad aspects of a given situation. You can't be impulsive. We would say in American English, you can't lunge at the ball. You've got to take your time, get more input, use all the time you possibly can without allowing yourself to become paralyzed, waiting for that last perfect bit of data. So I think in summary, my decision-making now as a more senior person is slower, but I hope more effective, because by slowing down, I am able to bring more data, more ideas, more different viewpoints together to make the most coherent decision. So I'd say that is kind of the speed with which you make decisions is the principal way in which things slow down.
I will jump on that, if you may. When I listened to you, you mentioned that when you were a young soldier, you were applying some instinct, but basically I will call that you were applying some formula and method, so a little bit more science. And with the time you evolved to the strategic commander you are, you use a little bit more art. And it's quite interesting to see that science is something that can be repeated. And there are more and more science now going into decision making. Why? Because a lot of industry are trying to say to everyone, there are so many data that you will need science to process. So how do you, could be an advice would give to the new commander regarding all the data they have?
Number one, take advantage of the changes in technology that allow the processing of data at high speed. And we're right on the beginning of that. And of course, this takes us immediately to the idea of artificial intelligence, of the ability to process millions of previous decisions that were made and then map that against the current set of circumstances in front of you. So point one is take advantage of that technology, recognizing it's going to continue to change and evolve. But a good commander is looking for tools to help him or her process all that data. Point two, equally important, is you have to bring that human judgment to bear. That's something that, at least thus far, artificial intelligence cannot provide. Science, if you will, cannot provide that. This is where we talk about commander's instinct, about bringing together a lifetime of experiences and using them to inform the facts on the table in front of you. And then I think third and finally, as a commander, you have to be capable and indeed willing to take input from your subordinates. Often commanders, because they either have a very large ego or they have very proclivity toward anger, they tend to push subordinates away with this idea that only they can come up with the answer. I have always said, and I firmly believe, no one of us, no one person, no one nation, no one alliance, no one company, no one person, no one of us is as smart as all of us thinking together. I didn't realize that when I was a 28-year-old driving a destroyer around. But as a 52-year-old Supreme Allied Commander, I realized that. And I think those three things would be my advice.
Yeah, that's great. I think that people should not rely on machine to take decision, because it's like GPS and navigation and dead reckoning navigation. So the people are not able anymore to do that reckoning navigation because they rely on GPS. If our leaders just rely on machine to take decision, they will lose that skill which make us so unique to take the right decision at the right moment and to take the risk.
So I guess my question is really, how do you see we can balance that desire for information versus the timeliness of information required on that scenario?
I think every scenario is going to present a different amount of time that you can take to make a decision. And here, for example, one of the darkest experiences of the U.S. Navy was the shoot down of an Iranian civilian airliner by the cruiser Vincennes. And this was during a period of very heightened tension, and the watch team in the Combat Information Center incorrectly believed that the incoming aircraft was an Iranian attack aircraft. They were wrong, and it turned out it was an Iranian Airbus. And so the U.S. Navy shot it down, killing 150 innocent Iranians who are simply flying across the Persian Gulf. That was a tactical decision where the watchkeeper felt that he had run out of time. He had to make a decision, and it turns out his decision was wrong. If he had waited another 10 seconds, probably 20 seconds at most, he would have seen the profile of that commercial aircraft ascending. He had simply watched it come in, and it was still preparing to climb out. If it had begun that ascent, I think he correctly would have assessed it as a commercial airliner. That's an example of a terrible tactical decision where you feel like you've run out of time. But if only he could have held himself back another 20 seconds, he would have gotten to the right decision. The converse to that, perhaps, the longest campaign in modern American history, of course, has been the war in Afghanistan. And here we had been at that, we were at that for 20 years, from the attack of 9/11, when all of NATO and many coalition nations went to Afghanistan. And that went through change after change after change. And I would say there we probably allowed the timeline to extend too far, well beyond where we needed it to be. And, the U.S. experience in Vietnam is another example of where decision makers with the best of intentions just keep trying to gather data, hoping the answer is going to change. And sometimes you can err in waiting too long, and sometimes you can err in jumping too fast. So that's a long way of saying there's no simple answer to that question. It's going to depend on where you are, but I'll close by reiterating Christophe's point of a moment ago, which is that you don't want to outsource that decision to a machine, either that tactical quick reaction or that longer strategic one. I think that still requires the kind of balance and judgment that the human mind brings to the table.
So how, in your experience then, I mean, I know you were SACEUR around the Libyan invasion time. How did you find that instinct versus data in that scenario?
Yeah, this was in 2011 when Muammar Gaddafi threatened to attack and make the streets at Benghazi run with blood. He threatened his population. He had shown the means to do it. We had intelligence that suggested he was about to massacre that population. The United Nations came to NATO and said, exercise the international responsibility to protect RTP and stop Gaddafi from massacring his population. So we did that. This was UN Security Council resolutions, 2 of them that authorized NATO to do so. But we were very careful in how we applied force in that scenario. We did it from the air and we did it at sea. And in particular, we sought to take away the means of Gaddafi to conduct those massacres. Ultimately, of course, his own people rose up and captured him and killed him. But in terms of decision-making, as Supreme Allied Commander in that period, I wanted to stay within the lines of the UN Security Council resolutions, which had told me to create a no-fly zone, under discussion today, obviously, in Ukraine, to stop any arms from going into Libya, and above all, to prevent Gaddafi from massacring his own people. So we did that, I think, very effectively. Could we have, for example, targeted Gaddafi or his family or the Libyan military headquarters? Sure, we could have done that quite easily. But we stayed within the lifelines of the UN Security Council resolutions, and I think we did that well. And that's an example of a decision maker who stays within the boundaries of where you are required to operate. And that can be very difficult sometimes. And I had subordinates saying, let's amp this up. Let's do more. Let's launch more strikes. Let's consider special forces. There were a lot of things under consideration, but we worked very hard to ensure that the decision stayed within the bounds of legality, of policy, and of, above all, of the UN Security Council resolutions.
Thank you, Admiral. We appreciate it. And I think in closing, there were a couple things that came to mind, and that was the last line of the Count of Monte Cristo, and that all human wisdom can be summed up in two words, and that is wait and hope. And I believe you summed that up along with General Powell's sentiment. Thank you for your time, sir. Appreciate it.